Hi, this is Dwight again. Today we're going to talk about the Russian Federation. We sometimes think of Russia as having, its modern roots in the 20th century. However, its history goes back much farther than that, all the way to the Kievan Rus, Prince Oleg back in 882, when he became the first actual ruler of all of Russia, as it's sometimes called. After 700 years of the Ruriks, there were 300 years of the Romanovs. Then there was a few months, if you will, of the Russian Republic, followed by the October Revolution, which put the Soviets firmly in control. It's the pre-Soviet political system was absolutist autocracy. The Tsars were absolute rulers of Russia. Their word was law. While geographically huge, however, Russia has been a very backwards country for a long time. It was only after World War I that they actually started industrializing in any sort. In 1858, around 94% of the population of Russia lived in small rural village communities, mostly covering out a hand-to-mouth existence, subsistence agriculture at its finest. Life expectancy at that time was around 27, because subsistence agriculture is not really conducive to long lifespans, working sun up to sundown in order to get just enough food to eat. Even as certain parts of the country were modernizing, however, the country's class structure remained more medieval than a modern society. Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia in the years 1682 to 1725, was one of the world history's most famous modernizing figures. He looked at his country and said, "This must change, because if we look at what's happening in the rest of Europe, they're getting stronger and we're just kind of staying the same." Tsar Alexander III was notoriously anti-reform, however. As late as 1881, he pronounced the Tsar's Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy shortly after ascending the throne, which that meant was that whatever I want, I get. It was also reinforced by religious ideology. The Eastern Orthodox Church was opposed to rational scientific forms of education for quite some time. As late as 1897, 72% of Russians aged 10 and over were illiterate, compared with just 17% in France in 1900. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 exposed Russia's weakness and complacency. They realized that if they didn't start modernizing, they would quickly be colonized by someone much more powerful. Russian industrial power grew quite rapidly during the years 1885 to 1910, hampered by weaknesses in transport, education, and banking sectors. I mean, if you look at the size of Russia, the transport problem still exists to this day. Alexander III appointed Count Sergei Witte as Minister of Finance in 1892, a role with very broad powers. Witte placed Russia on the gold standard, which allowed the nation to borrow more cheaply in international financial markets and encouraged a lot of international financial investments. Foreign direct investment is the lifeblood of any developing country. So they brought in advanced foreign technology on pretty much a huge scale. There was inward investment. Steps were finally taken to educate the population with the requisite skills. 140 new commercial schools opened up. But even as cities were developing international trade, the Russian agrarian economy remained extremely large and extremely weak. It was still a huge proportion of the economy and was still not using any type of modern technology. The real tipping point for the Russian Republic was probably the military's disastrous performance on the Eastern Front in 1914 to 17 in the First World War. Russia lost about 1.8 million men then. And what happened was radical writings on socialism and communism were spreading around Russia. The Russian revolutionary leader, Vladimir Ivanovich Lenin, from 1870 to 1824, argued that a working-class revolution will take place not in the most economically advanced nations, but in the weakest link of the imperialist chain, and he found it in Russia. After a period of intense protest and desperate attempts at economic and agricultural reform, the Tsarist system finally ended with the Russian Revolution in March of 1917. The Bolshevik was one of the most dramatic events of the 20th century, in part because it was carried almost live by the newspapers of the day. Lenin's seizure of power led to an extremely brutal civil war between 1917 and 1921. which again dampened some of the modernizing efforts. What happens was Russia immediately pulled out of the First World War, which is largely seen by the population as an imperialist venture, thereby angering, its allies. Of course, when Lenin died, he was succeeded by Joseph Stalin, who was actually a Georgian, who set in motion what turned out to be a spectacular economic growth phase. But the violence and paranoia of the era were hugely destructive, which caused really profound damage to the system as a whole. Intensified levels of cultural and political repression, sending millions to the death camps, as aptly described by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. A program of collectivization of agriculture was banned most forms of commercial farming, and basically took all these little farms that were owned by folks called kulaks and turned them into state-run farms. Accompanying that agricultural modernization, there was a dramatic crash program of industrialization. Stalin's vision was to build a second America, a country emerging out of the wilderness, basically. And he thought it could be done with centralizing, the economy. The Stalinist bureaucracy constructed a planning apparatus built around 5-year plans, which are, were used up until 1991, actually, for modernizing the economy. Enterprises were given state goals, and under the planning ministry, Gosplan. But in 1939, in some sectors, as much as 35 to 30% of industrial output was estimated to be defective in numerous ways. The problem with setting rigid plans and then imprisoning folks who don't meet them is that people will cheat, they'll lie, and that's what happened. The plans were met, but for example, if you didn't get enough leather from the leather works to make shoes in your shoe factory, well, rather than making them in a variety, you made them all in size 2 because it took a lot less leather. Senior figures in planning have been widely known to have been influenced by the writings of Fred Taylor, but let's not hold that against Fred Taylor. But it did achieve one of the most rapid industrializations in history, a 4-fold increase in gross industrial output between 1928 and 1950, which is fantastic, actually. It did this by keeping wages low, taxes high, and enforcing extremely tough forms of bureaucratic labor discipline. Those aforementioned work camps. Soviet society rapidly urbanized. All industrialized societies tend to urbanize as there's this mass migration of folks from the outer core into the cities to work in the new factories. Personal incomes, however, during that period, 1928 to 1952, increased only 1/3, even though output increased 4-fold. Of course, the 1930s were also characterized by more revolution, more repression, and a vicious regime of political control that is now known as the Great Terror. You could be sent to the labor camps for merely checking out the wrong book from the library. So millions of citizens, perhaps as many as 29 million, were at one stage Zeks. All Zek means is prisoner. They weren't allowed to have their actual names in the prisons. The Gulag labor camp inmates. Of course, then World War II began. So what happened is Russia played a rather large role in World War II. Their methods of fighting, left a bit to be desired, where you had, the political officers standing behind the frontline troops, with guns to make sure that no one ever retreated, which is one of the reasons why their losses were so high. But the defeat of Germany did add a lot of credence, I should say, to the Soviet Union. Stalin died in '53. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, promised a direction away from the terror and oppression, followed by the greater cultural freedom. And he was the first Soviet leader to actually denounce, the era of Stalinism, even going so far as to mention the 30 million Russians who died under the collectivization of agriculture. 20 million Russians who died under collectivization of agriculture. They were just seen as part of the process by Stalin. The USSR spent vast sums on its military to make itself strong, basically, it invested in science and engineering, and I was one of a generation that awoke one morning to find Sputnik, a Russian satellite, circling the Earth. the first man-made object in space. And it was quite a wake-up call for us in the U.S., as you might guess. But present-day Russia now has a very well-educated population, a strong tradition of higher education, some outstanding universities, especially in the hard sciences and engineering. Problem is that the economy wasn't quite so good in other areas. You might have seen photos of long bread lines in the Soviet Union of people waiting to buy just the basics of life. And because of that, a large shadow economy grew, the black market. And the black market is always inherently corruptive in that bribes need to be paid to keep it operating. But by the early 1970s, Russia was the largest, or the Soviet Union was the world's second largest economy. The problem is, instead of growing from strength to strength, the economy stagnated as it grew. It was running out of puff, if you will. It was being stifled by its own bureaucracy, by the planning, and by the fact that nobody was really working that hard. I remember a quote, I think it was from Gorbachev, who said, well, the workers pretended to work and we pretended to pay them. And when you remove all incentives from society, as Gorbachev rightly pointed out, what happens is inevitable. Mediocrity becomes the norm. So Brezhnev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1964. And they would find it harder and harder to compete against economically and militarily, both with the capitalist societies that enjoyed higher rates of innovation and higher rates of productivity. It's hard to force people to be innovative or productive. And of course, there were production bottlenecks. Remember that the transportation was still not well developed. So a lot of the food coming in from the outer regions, to the center, spoiled in transit. By 1885, the USSR was the third largest economy in the world, but was ranked 43rd per capita. It was starting its downhill slide. Without competition, there's little incentive for enterprises to improve, to innovate, in order to invest in research and development, because they're just tasked with, maintaining the status quo and, of course, to meet their quotas. Gorbachev was appointed General Secretary in 1985, and that was the first of a younger generation. If you were a follower, a Sovietologist, or a Kremlinologist, as he used to say, you notice that the rulers of the Soviet Union were getting increasingly to be geriatrics. And while there are some exceptions of exceptional geriatrics like Ronald Reagan, a lot of them don't really have a lot of innovation and a lot of new ideas coming through. They're pretty happy with the status quo. But Gorbachev had two key improvements, or two key reforms he was going to make. One of them is perestroika, which is restructuring in Russian. The other one was glasnost, which is openness. But he proved unable to contain those forces of change in the end. What happened was he got run over by the train he set loose. In the end, the hardliners moved against Gorbachev in a military coup, a move that backfired as the Russian public rallied around the reformist Russian President Boris Yeltsin. You might remember the famous pictures of Yeltsin standing atop a tank outside of the White House in Moscow, telling the hardliners to surrender. It was quite a dramatic moment in human history. It appeared that markets and democracy were the only option. The USSR was disbanded in December 1991, and 15 of its nations recast as independent democratic countries, some of which that still remain so. The reform under Yeltsin from 1991 to 1999 went through with a rush. He put a young economist in charge, Yevgeny Gaidar, And what Gaidar was able to do was to introduce shock therapy, which we've talked about before in terms of places like Poland and in South America, that brought in a very rapid privatization of the economy. But the problem was, it had all kinds of opportunities for organized crime and official corruption, which led to somewhat of an industrial collapse. Became a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy is a governmental system based upon theft, in this case, theft of government property. They were mismanaged. By 1998, Russian GDP per capita was ranked 135th in the world, right around the level of Costa Rica in South America, Central America. Having lost its biggest customer, which is the state plan, Russian industry simply stopped producing. There was no need for their goods. I remember a famous anecdote where a tractor company in Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, found its tractors in demand in Western Europe, and they wondered what the heck was going on. Turns out that a couple of Western European steel mills were buying the tractors, shipping them west on trains, and then melting them down for scrap. Because the quality workmanship, they were worth much more as scrap metal than they were as actual operating tractors. Registered crimes doubled in Russia in the years 1985 to 1998, with homicide rates in the mid-90s climbing to 3 times higher than the U.S. and then higher than Mexico and Brazil as well. So what happened was, under this system of organized corruption, business persons needed to ensure they had a krisha, literally a roof over them, to offer protection. Corporate laws such as property rights and shareholder rights were often unclear. Corporate takeovers in Russia were actually just that. The person, you came in with a bunch of thugs with guns, and suddenly the factory was yours. At that time, we started using the metaphor of the Wild East to describe the informality and violence rather than the legal system. Gaidar abandoned price fixing in 1992, which led to runaway inflation around 250%, but what happened when you abandoned price fixing is that the black market started dying out and goods started coming back into the legal market. Small-scale privately run shops, kiosks, and later cafes, hotels, and restaurants emerged all over Russia. Turns out that 70 years of the Soviets, and 1,000 years of Tsars hadn't quite killed off the entrepreneurial instinct of the Russians. Between 1992 to 1996, the number of state-owned enterprises declined from 205,000 to around 91,000, with perhaps as much as 90% of industrial capacity transferred to private ownership, and that's where the widespread fraud kicked in. The oligarchs who currently run Russia, many of them got their start back then. They used leveraged loans from friendly banks to buy out these newly privatized industries, and they still hold them. At this stage, government sold shares in key-owned enterprises during the second stage rather than giving them away en masse, and most of the new owners of these firms became fabulously rich. And the saddest part of this thing is because they didn't really have to compete against anybody. I mean, you met your plan, you met your goal. You sold to the one customer, the state. You had a monopsony. So what happened was these enterprises were just woefully underprepared to engage in a transition to a market economy. They had no idea of meeting the customer's needs. Wages dropped to such levels that enterprises could keep labor on, so they were able to postpone, the collapse. There were signs of stabilization in 1997, but it turned out to be illusory, as the economy ground to a halt in the August 1998 Russian financial crash. Domestic industry recovered as foreign imports became extremely expensive because of the collapse of the ruble's value. Yeltsin resigned as president in 1999, handing power to Vladimir Putin. Freudian slip on my part. Putin and his inner circle emerged with a strongman, Siloviki, who managed to reinforce the power of the Russian state that slid into decay under Yeltsin. Yeltsin was a true Democrat, Putin not so much. So what happened was there was a return to state control under Putin. Arbitrary use of political power remains a problem of Putin's approach, is partly condemned as anti-democratic and secretive. But the economic status improved significantly under Putin. Real incomes grew by 11.5% in 2006 alone. But even with a more robust state, official corruption was still a huge problem. Russia is now the world's second largest arms exporter, for example. It's carrying around 12 billion of export sales. And the space technologies have staged a remarkable comeback. A problem is that oil and gas exports account for about 2/3 of Russia's export income. And if you're looking at the price of gas and oil today, you'll see why that remains a problem. The clear vulnerabilities in the Russian economy, of course, are dependence on raw materials exports. There's still a big hole in the ground where you dig stuff up and sell it. A rather primitive, low-cost, low-quality, low-wage industrial economy, and a rather limited capacity for a high-tech and informational economy. It could be a powerful but unstable model, but there are some ongoing problems. Budishaya, which means the future. The World Bank projects a negative growth outlook for Russia in 2015, 2016, with the economy expected to contract by 3.8% in 2015 and modestly decline by 0.3% in 2016. The OECD figures are very similar. They projected to fall around 3% this year and climb by less than 2% next year. At the heart of Russia's problem, they're suffering a serious economic malaise right now with the price of the ruble collapsing, oil exports being worth dramatically less than they were. When oil started crashing, Putin's budget was based upon oil at $111 a barrel, as I recall. Well, at $30 a barrel, you're not buying a lot. So a lot of cash, suddenly disappeared, and Russia didn't have a lot of reserves because those had already been spent. But the real core of Russia's malaise is none of this stuff. It's the weakening of market forces and suppression of competition, which means there literally isn't much of a market economy. It's crony capitalism with an authoritarian edge, if you will. Rather than all the stuff we're stealing has been stolen already, so the kleptocracy is gone. But what's happening right now is that, if you are not part of the inner circle, you just don't hang on to your business. You're not able to produce. Although Russia no longer has God's plan anymore, the expansion of the state has meant it no longer matters because the state still controls massive parts of the economy. And there's skewed incentives such as corruption and a true lack of enforcement of property rights. How bad things have gotten? Currently, Russia ranks 136 out of 175 on corruption by Transparency International. And Freedom House scores Russia 6 on freedom, 6 on political rights, and 6 on civil liberties. That's on a 7-point scale, 7 being the lowest number, so things aren't going well there. This is the first economy we're talking about where I'm really not hopeful. There's some underlying strength there. But right now, the structural problems are strangling whatever Russian economy there might be. And I don't see that changing, very much in the near future. Well, that's it for me. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.